If your company handed you a performance improvement plan this week, stop focusing on the title, coaching plan, development plan, success plan. Those are all labels. The action behind it is what matters. So stay with me, because the real story isn't what the document is, it's what's going to happen and what happened before it ever reached your desk. I'm Noel, founder of HR Armor, strategic case architect. I spent 30 years inside of executive HR, private sector, federal, nonprofit, global organizations, and I was in the room where terminations decisions get made, and I helped build the frameworks that made those decisions defensible. I also navigated the system personally when it came from me too. This show is HR Armor, when work turns against you, and every episode comes from both sides of those tables. So let's just hop in, right? A PIP is not a performance tool. It is a documentation tool, and the purpose is to create a paper trail that justifies a termination decision that has already been made. HR doesn't build the PIP to save your job. HR builds a PIP to protect the company when it ends your job. That is the purpose of it. And the moment the PIP lands on your desk, someone above HR already signed off on it, because HR is not the beginning and the end of the say. They're just the ones who documented and put the paperwork together to issue to you. So here's what happens before the PIP comes your way, right? There are people who get together inside of a room. They are the ones who determine what gets decided. It usually goes through general counsel, legal, the company's attorneys, the people who make those higher decisions, the executive team. They are usually the ones who actually make the final decision in collaboration with your manager. HR is the one who has coached your manager to tell them what to write, how to write it, what to say, what not to say, how to document, how not to document going forward once your manager brought the complaint to them about wanting to get you out. So by the time you actually get the document, the strategy is already months old, months in and waiting, months in progress. It was not something that just happened a week or two before. There's a lot of time and energy that goes into it on the back end before you ever get involved. So, a few cues that will help you understand that this process is happening in the background before the PIP ever arrives on your desk. So, things such as manager meetings getting shorter. Maybe you had a weekly meeting scheduled with your manager, and then all of a sudden, instead of 30 minutes, they're shortened to 15 minutes. Maybe your manager had a running meeting scheduled with you, and all of a sudden they continue to cancel those meetings. Before, they would be on time, they would show up, it would be a conversation back and forth. Now, all of a sudden, you don't even see it on the manager's calendar. That's not a mistake. It's actually a process that's happening behind the scenes that you just weren't aware of. Other things that you can keep an eye out for that shows you that something is brewing behind the scenes is that feedback gets formal. So maybe your manager was someone who would have an actual conversation and give you pointers, give you tips, communicate with you on a verbal basis, maybe even passing through the hallway or passing in and out of an office. But when the feedback becomes verbal and then formal, you know something has shifted, especially if the temperament and the temperature of the supervisor was always kind of casual. But all of a sudden, when it turns professional and then you get a follow up email after the meeting, then you know by then something has changed behind the scenes. When everything is in writing is not a coincidence at all. The documentation phase has already started. That's when you know that something is brewing, and something like the PIP they're going to start to make official, because everything starts to change and you can feel and see the change in your manager's actual behavior day to day. There's many names for a PIP. We're just going to hop back in because a lot of people think that It has to be called a PIN, performance improvement plan, a PIP, but it doesn't, right? The original name is PIP, Performance Improvement Plan. That was the original name. So this is inside of Q, right? The reason that supervisors, HR, leadership have moved away from calling it a PIP only or saying it's a performance improvement plan is because it immediately triggers a defense. Employees immediately recognize it. They hear the terminology, they know what a PIP is, and then sometimes the employees automatically get their defenses together and they try to lawyer up. So companies want to move away from that. And a lot of them abandon that name entirely because of that reason, because it incites employees in a way that managers are not ready for them to be made aware of, because they want employees to still be in the dark about the situation and not have a strategic foresight of what's about to happen next. There's many other words and combinations that leadership and companies use to call what was a PIP, performance improvement plan, something else. So instead of a PIP, they'll say something like performance development plan, which is a PDP. It's softer language, and they say things such as investing in your growth. But guess what? It's still a PIP. A performance development plan is still a PIP. They soften the language, but it's still preparing you to be moved out. They also call it a coaching plan. So, a coaching plan, it implies support. It implies that the company is kind of on your side, that your supervisor is in your corner, but it is actually a documented performance record. It is a performance tool. Something else they call it is success plan. And that's the most aggressive reframe, right? Because they use the word success as if it's for your benefit, for your bequest, something that's actually going to help you out. The word success is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Employees feel as though it is being supportive for their success so that they can get promoted, they can get a higher job, a better title, more notoriety, a better seat at the table, or something else. So it's designed to make you feel collaborative, for you to feel safe while they're still running a clock out. Something else that employees call it is an action plan. Was vague enough to feel administrative, but it's specific enough to be used in a termination meeting. Some of my clients have been on so called action plans, and how they've described it and how I've seen it in a company policy is that the action plan, the terminology action plan, was a precursor to a performance improvement plan. However, if someone failed that, the next step was not to be put on a performance improvement plan, but it was to be given some type of settlement agreement or some type of last chance agreement, which the supervisor would present to the employee and say, okay, because you failed this action plan, instead of going on to the next step in the process, we are willing as a company to part ways with you. And we're going to offer you this in lieu of your resignation instead of going to the next step, which may terminate you from that point. Does that make sense? I hope it does. So the action plan, although it is a precursor to a so called performance improvement plan in some companies, it is still in lieu of a performance improvement plan, because once you fail that, your option is termination as a resignation, or if you want to attempt to move forward with the next process, and then they would most likely terminate you anyway. Something else that I've seen companies use as far as terminology, instead of a PIP, performance improvement plan, they've actually called it a performance action plan. So it's kind of a split of the difference between a performance improvement plan, a PIP, and an action plan, which I just described, but it's honestly the same instrument. It's just another name, another color of the crayon box. Something else they call it, I've seen, is an accountability plan. Accountability plan frames it so that the employee is a problem, kind of like an indictment. It's saying that the employee has to be accountable for certain aspects of their performance. And then the company uses words such as, if you are unable to do X, Y, and Z, there would be consequences up to and including termination. So, accountability plans, when given to an employee, is not accountability for both ways, which is both ways from the supervisor and the employee. Is accountability that the employee is required to do X, Y, and Z, and there's no accountability for anybody else in the team or in the leadership chain that would be supportive for that employee. I've also seen it named 360, 90-day plan. So, such as a 30-day plan, a 60-day plan, and a 90-day plan, which so happens to be the same increments that PIPs are typically issued in. Think about it. PIPs are usually issued in increments of 30 days, increments of 60 days, increments of 90 days. So when organizations and companies use 30, 60, 90-day plans, it's the same thing as a PIP. They just change the terminology without saying PIP, performance improvement plan. They're just using numerical values in lieu of that. Another thing I've seen is individual development plans, which are also IDPs. And this one could honestly be a little bit tricky because some IDPs are supposed to be use as far as like educational tools. So if you go to your supervisor and you want to get extra training, extra certification, something along those lines, sometimes supervisors will have you complete an IDP, an individual development plan, and then they would help you to achieve those goals, which could include something like getting the credentials you need for a promotion or something else along your career path that you wanted to do. However, IDPs in other contexts with some companies are used like a pip and a wrapper. The difference is whether you initiated it, which would be if you want to go to some courses, some training, some type of advanced classes, or if the IDP was handed to you. So that's the difference, and that's the distinction. If the IDP was handed to you, the IDP actually equals a PIP. If you're the one who initiated the IDP, then it most likely is a legitimate reason for you to get the coaching and the training and the support that you need. But if your supervisor gave it to you, it may be another story. And the last thing I've seen is something called managed performance process. It's not actually a neutral process, but actually a managed performance process is the exact same thing as a PIP. A PIP is a managed performance process. It just so happens that at the end of the PIP, most of the time people are terminated unless they're doing certain things before that actually happens. So if you think about a tomato, right? People say it's tomato, they call it tomato. Some people call a tomato a fruit. Some people call it a vegetable. You can eat a tomato raw. You can put it in your salad, you can eat it raw. You can cook tomatoes to make tomato sauce for a pasta, for example. You put it in your salad. So there's different ways for you to prepare a tomato. There's different ways for you to say the word tomato versus tomato. And even though the name sound may be changing, and even though the preparation of the product may be changing, it's still a tomato. So at the end of the day, the PIP works the same way. You can call it a success plan. You can call it a coaching plan. You can call it a development plan. You can call it a 30-day, 60-day, 90-day plan. The preparation changes, the name may change, the packaging of terminology, those labels may change, but what does not change is it's still a PIP. It's still designed to build a documented record that ends in one outcome. So don't get distracted by what they call it. Always ask what it is because questions actually matter. Let me help you understand what questions I would always recommend for employees to ask because If you're unsure, I mean, there could be other names that companies are using because companies are very skillful with this that I may not be aware of yet. Here's 4 questions that can help you determine if it truly is something that is supportive or if it's something that is intended to get you out the door. One of the questions is there a timeline with specific deadlines? So when you look at the document yourself, there should be specific dates. So there should have a start date and it should have an end date. If there's a timeline with specific deadlines within that timeline, then most likely it could be a PIP, even if it's called something else. The second question is there a consequence named if you do not meet those specific timelines that are within those deadlines that are established in that document? But they say, for example, on the form, on the document in the paper, if you don't do X, Y, and Z by this date, then you have failed to meet this criteria. Failing to meet this criteria may have adverse consequences up to and including termination. That would be if there's a consequence named inside of the timeline for you not meeting that expectation. The third question that you should ask yourself when you're looking at a document that was handed to you is someone documenting your progress against it? For example, do you have now scheduled meetings that are incremental that were not scheduled before this document with your team leader, with your supervisor, with human resources? Are there additional check ins? Are there additional aspects that were not there before you received that document that you are now being held against? Was someone documenting your progress now after the document was delivered to you, which differs from what happened before? And then the fourth question you should ask yourself is, have they asked me to sign the document? And if your answer to any of those 4 questions is yes, it's a PIP. Call it whatever you want, say whatever, it's still a tomato. I want to tell you about a situation because it shows you exactly how a PIP gets initiated and what is actually driving it. This is just one of many examples that I have dealt with in my professional career. Okay, so a supervisor called me urgently, right? I had an office and supervisor was calling me like, hey, Noel, I really got to reach you. Send me a Teams message. I really need to speak with you urgently. Would call my cell phone. I really need to speak with you urgently. Would call my desk phone. I really need to speak with you urgently. He came to my office and he started going immediately off about an employee that he wanted to get rid of. He said that the employee was not a team player, was harming morale inside of the department, inside of the division, and that he wanted to put him on a PIP because he didn't complete an assignment as he was directed to do. That's what the supervisor said to me. When the supervisor did not know is that the employee had already called me too. He had already came to me because I was a trusted advisor. I kept it straight on both sides. So they know if they came to me, I was going to give it straight. I was going to be an active listener. I was going to hear what they had to say, but I was going to hear underneath all of whatever anybody was saying to understand what the root of the problem was and getting to the bottom of it and not just going forward with whatever anybody is saying without getting that detailed information for myself to make an informed analysis of the situation. So I was always on the side of the law. It didn't matter what side of the table, whether if it was a supervisor, a director, an executive, a blue collar worker, and it didn't even matter. Like none of that mattered at all because what mattered to me was the law, and the law is what dictated everything. What does the policy say? What do the rules say? The employee's version was that the supervisor wanted him to complete a form, but completing that form was not his actual job. It was the job of the team lead, not his. So what he did was he questioned the supervisor, but how he questioned him was in front of the rest of the team. The supervisor felt disrespected. When I started asking the supervisor specific questions, like, What was the documentation? What was the actual performance issues? What was the actual business impact? And all it came down to was a personality conflict. The supervisor came from a culture where if an employee spoke up, the supervisor immediately felt disrespected, as if he was not being respected as a leader. And the employee questioned his authority as a sign of disrespect and a sign of disobedience, a sign of an employee failing to follow instructions. So he wanted the employee out based on that. But when I started questioning him as far as the assignment itself and everything else that was going on, it was not a professional failure. It was not a failure to follow instructions. It was not a failure to perform his duties. It was a conflict of cultural expectation that was never verbalized and something that the employee clearly had no idea. I mean, it was a complete personality conflict that was dressed up as a performance issue, honestly. So I had to break it down with them each separately, of course. But I had to break it down with them to get to the actual root of the problem. Like, what is the real problem? Was it performance? No. Was there a documentation trail that the supervisor had that would have supported a PIP? No. Was there policy violation? No. Was there a supervisor whose authority felt challenged? An employee who did not know he was already being positioned for removal because the supervisor did not like the employee's attitude? Yes. So it had nothing to do with performance. It actually had to do with conduct, but in the supervisor's mind, it was the actual performance issue. But in my assessment of the situation, it wasn't even a conduct issue because the employee was simply asking a question, and the supervisor felt as if he was being disrespected because it would happen in an open space in front of the team. So the supervisor wanted the PIP because his ego was bruised. Here's the biggest thing: I mitigated the situation because I was asking the right questions. I was hearing both sides. I was listening to both sides and I was digging through deep to the root of the actual problem. But had that been another organization, had that been another company, had it been another HR, they would have probably processed the PIP because the supervisor called umpteen times claiming it was an urgent matter that needed immediate attention. And a lot of times, HR takes the supervisor's word for it and takes action based on that. But me asking the questions that I ask stop that process from happening. But that is the system that you're navigating. That is the situations in the workforce. You won't always have HR people, especially like me, who dug deep to ask specific questions and didn't just jump when there was some type of issue or some type of disagreement or some type of situation that needed mitigation. I always listen to all the information before taking any action at all, because listening is a critical part of human resources that a lot of human resources people don't always do. If a company has a HR or policy manual or something around progressive discipline or performance, it always includes specific steps. It always includes specific steps as to what needs to happen before a PIP or something similar to a PIP is actually issued. That could be things like a verbal warning, a written warning, a final warning, training, mentorship, partnering with a senior level employee. So there could be a lot of different steps that are involved that a supervisor may do to help the employee, which is in alignment with the policy itself. But a lot of times when supervisors are really anxious and really trying to take immediate action, that anxiety that they have, that urgency that they have transfers over to human resources and leadership. And they try to make them take actions without actually reviewing the policy and checking the checking the boxes and making sure everything was actually done as it should have been done before taking that final action. And it's actually not an oversight because companies have a policy for a reason. They have a manual for a reason. They have a handbook for a reason. It's actually a decision because they know what they're doing. They know that a policy exists. They know that a handbook exists. They know that a process exists. But in the heat of the moment, in the heat of the time, none of that matters. What matters is the manager wanting what they want to happen and going to human resources or going to their leadership and taking those steps to make that action happen. You would have no idea that a termination decision was coming down the line. You would just have no idea because managers escalate things without completing the documented steps, and that gets overlooked in lieu of having a speedy decision, getting a problem employee out of the office, getting a problem employee out of the job. Managers make those quick decisions. Speed matters more than priority. Priority matters more over process. That is just really the bottom line there. When a company skips its own progressive discipline policy and gets straight to a PIP, that gap actually matters. Not in an abstract way, but in a documentation way, in a dispute way. The question is whether you know what to actually look for. Because most employees are given onboarding documents in the handbook during orientation. And one of the first things that I do when someone comes to me with a PIP is I pull the company handbook, I pull those policies, I pull those procedures because that determines what happens next. It also determines whether you were placed on a PIP or something similar to a PIP in a procedure that was actually according to the company policy. And that gap tells me whether something is legit and how the company is actually building the case against you. So if you are holding a document right now with the timeline, with the consequence, with the signature line, with someone documenting what you're doing, then you may already be in it. So pull your company handbook, find the progressive discipline policy, find the performance management policy and see what it actually says. And write down the dates, the times of conversations for every single feedback that you've received in those moments because that matters more than you know right now. Don't sign anything without understanding what you're agreeing to because that line on the bottom, your signature isn't what's critical, it's what it says above that that matters the most. That is the critical line that matters more than everything else. Make sure that you're not just signing for acknowledging receipt. Make sure it's not saying that you agree to what it's saying. Make sure you read what's actually above that signature line, whatever that disclaimer is, before you sign it. Make sure you read the whole document, but definitely make sure you know what you're actually signing for before you sign it. And if you're on a PIP right now or something with a different name that doesn't say actually PIP, then you need the strategy right now. It's time for you to have the strategy now before your next meeting, before the next discussion, before the next scheduled event, not after you get terminated. So if you need help, go to hr-armor, armor.com/rapid-strategy session. That's hr-armor.com/rapid-strategy-session. And if you're actively inside something so that I can help you out, you can get my direct support. Next time, we're going to be talking about investigations and what that actually looks like and how to survive an investigation against you. So I'm Noel. This is HR Armor When Work Turns Against You podcast. And I'm here to pull the curtain back because someone has to say this out loud.